to our next guest now. In the Australia Defence Force, Defence Association says it may be difficult to prove allegations of past abuses in the military.
The government says it may be legally liable over physical and sexual abuse in the military and has received hundreds of complaints since the issue came to light recently. Neil James is the Executive Director of the Australia Defence Association, and he is with us in the studio. And many thanks for joining us. You have been a vocal critic of the Minister and the way he has managed this, but on this topic you seem to agree that a lot of these claims may lead to some legal responsibility on behalf of the Defence Force.
Well, there'll obviously have to be an investigation into any claim just on moral grounds. The problem will be records and witnesses, because a lot of these claims go back 40 years and a couple of them, in fact, have gone back to World War II. So it's going to be very difficult investigating some of them.
The fact that there are so many complaints, though, suggests that there is an issue there, a cultural issue within the Defence Force that needs to be addressed.
Well, I think there's two ways you've got to look at that. First of all, what Australian institution, be it a university, a school, a church, a Rotary Club, you name it, didn't have problems over the last 50 or 60 years to some extent, particularly if it's a large organisation like the Defence Force. And secondly, simply, a lot of these complaints are very old. There have been very few, very, very few from the last 10 or 15 years, and I think that probably shows there isn't a systemic problem at the moment in the Defence Force, but you wouldn't actually gain that view if you followed the news and all the public hysteria.
Yeah, what do you mean by very few? And it seems like you know the substance of these allegations?
Well, simply, let's keep this in perspective. I mean, the National Union of Students, for example, did a poll of 1,500 female Australian university students only 3 weeks ago, where 500 of them said they'd been sexually harassed and 10% said they'd been raped. Now, if you look at the Defence Force Academy, for example, its rate of complaints of sexual harassment, rape and sexual assault are dramatically lower.
What's few than that? How many are we talking in the last 10, 15 years?
Well, ADFA's never had a rape, for example, although there have been some allegations. And this is one of the first recent filming, which many people think is a sexual assault, probably was morally, even if the lawyers can't prove it, is probably one of the first sexual assaults. There's been a lot of...
But you said that there's been only a few in the last 10 or 15. What evidence are you basing that on? Have you been handed information about how many number of allegations have been made and the breakdown of what time they were? Well,
the Defence Association has a very long memory. And you might remember there was the Grey inquiry into ADFA in 1998. ADFA had some serious problems in the 1980s and 90s. Now, virtually all the complaints over the last week about ADFA are from that period. They're from a period when there was already an inquiry. They're not new complaints. So that would indicate to us that the problem isn't systemic and certainly not any worse than any other Australian tertiary institution, probably a lot better.
Neil James, could I put to you, though, that there is a culture of silence that has operated, potentially a culture of silence that has operated by the very nature of how the military operates? There's that, we heard Andrew Wilkie talking about it, you come in as a young cadet, there is certain treatment meted out that you then deliver as an older cadet, and it's about learning who's in charge, the chain of command. Isn't it possible that that culture of silence has quashed a lot of these allegations that are now coming out?
Well, that's predicated on there being a culture of silence. I wouldn't necessarily agree with that. I think one of the serious problems that this whole incident's brought out is the Australian people no longer get their own Defence Force. The levels of understanding of how a Defence Force works in our society are now poor that even the most ludicrous suggestion gets front page coverage in the newspapers, and the quality of the media coverage of this issue has hovered somewhere between poor and appalling.
If we don't know, how does it work? What happens that we are misled by?
Well, I think a lot of it we just have to calm down a bit. The Defence Force is gagged, particularly by this minister and many of his predecessors, and they're not allowed to defend himself or defend themselves, and that's how we saw the problem last week. Where the incident at ADFA now has two victims. It has the original female cadet who was assaulted, and it has the commandant of ADFA who was sacked by the minister when he was innocent.
He hasn't been sacked, he's been suspended.
Well, he's been suspended. In effect, his public record's been trashed on grounds that the minister has subsequently drip-fed out weren't true. There was public hysteria about this incident, and the minister overreacted, basically because he was reacting to the public hysteria. And now the facts have come out. It's going to be really interesting when the inquiries come out.
The point is that the facts remain that the young woman did face a disciplinary hearing that was unrelated, and the minister made that link as insensitive. Would you not agree that it was insensitive to hold a disciplinary hearing of a young girl who has just been through such a traumatic experience?
Well, see, you're reacting to the facts that were presented in the papers, not the facts that actually occurred, and that's the great tragedy of this instance.
That has been confirmed by Angus Houston.
No, it hasn't. What happened was that the Commandant of the Academy, who's her commander, made a command decision. She chose for the minor offence to go ahead. Now, the Minister...
She chose for it to go ahead. Should she have even been asked for it? Should she have even been asked to face it, to have the discussion?
Let's wait for the inquiry to show all the facts here. But the problem is simply that there was this ridiculous allegation that the charge was to bully her into silence. And the Minister then panicked and overreacted to that because of the public hysteria.
And he acknowledged that. He said that wasn't the case.
And that allegation was complete nonsense. The Commandant had already called in the police and there was already a disciplinary investigation going on. There was no need for that. Now, the lass in question had legal advice. She was counselled. She didn't want this hanging over her head, apparently, and she asked for it to go ahead. Now, that may have been the wrong decision, but it certainly didn't require the witch hunt that's occurred since then over this issue. It's actually quite tragic. There are 2 victims of the incident now.
I'm curious by your reaction to news or of these allegations, more allegations coming out, and you seem to be hosing down the allegations before they've even gone to any investigation.
No, look, that's not true at all. And in fact, we're very angry about some of the press coverage of our commentary over the weekend. Look,
can I read to you a direct quote that's on the ABC story regarding this? We'll take... The trouble is a lot of the allegations are old, some are clearly exaggerated, and then you go on to say some could even be false memory syndrome. What do you know about false memory syndrome and the relation to the allegations?
You've got to remember that quote is from a 10-minute interview of which they broadcast 10 seconds.
I know, but you said it, and I'm putting it to you now.
Yeah, OK, well, that's not what all I said. And we'll be taking it up with the ABC, the editing of that particular tape.
I suspect you've been directly quoted there talking about false memory syndrome.
Well, yeah, false memory syndrome could be part of it. The problem you've got with 40-year-old allegations, particularly where people are psychologically damaged, is what they think happened to them is not necessarily what happened to them.
What's your experience with false memory syndrome? I mean, it's easy to throw out there, but the science is not very strong.
And that's exactly the point I'm making. False memory syndrome is quite a danger, as any psychologist or scientist will explain to you, particularly in cases of sexual abuse. And
you made the point, though, that a lot of these people have been psychologically damaged. How do you think that happened?
Well, you have to look at each individual case. The tragedy of this is people are assuming the worst thing in every case. Now,
I don't think they are, actually.
Well, if I could just get a word in. Long experience has taught me there are 2 sides to every story. Now, the trouble with this is the media's only run with one side of the story, and because the media doesn't understand the Defence Force very well anymore, they've broadcast the most silly allegations. And there really needs to be a more calm and a more mature approach. Now, all these inquiries have come out. Good. We fully supported the inquiry. We're, in fact, the first organisation to call for an inquiry. But what's going to happen when the inquiry actually tells people things that the media have been telling them for a long time weren't true? And the public hysteria reacted to that. And that's why you see the Minister backpedalling over the last few days. I mean, he brought out the whole women in combat thing as a smokescreen, because we already have women in combat, and there's already a scientific study going on. Now he's made this remark yesterday about all the public liability claims, obviously another smokescreen, to cover the fact that last week, this country came very close to civil control of the military breaking down, not because the military weren't obeying the Minister, but because the Minister wasn't exercising civil control of the military properly.
Neil James, there's been a history of conflict between the Defence Force and the various ministers. How would you see a way forward in terms of repairing that relationship, and also, particularly perhaps, stopping that impression, whether it's through the media or not, and it's easy to put the media in the middle of it, they are reporting what's coming through to them, stopping this notion that the Defence Force is defensive and doesn't like to be examined, because that's surely not something that you want.
Well, it's not true, for a start.
No, but it's surely something you not want, whether it's true or not.
The Defence Force is one of the most highly examined elements of our society in terms of parliamentary and ministerial oversight. Now, the Defence Association for decades has campaigned for reform in the Department of Defence to improve accountability and oversight. For instance, there should be 3 full-time ministers. It's the 3rd largest employer in the country after Woolworths and Coles. It has a huge budget, and particularly under this current government with the reshuffle, the ministerial oversight in the last Gillard reshuffle was actually diluted. John Faulkner, probably the best defence minister in living memory, put in a great system for a ministerial team to oversight the department. And with no consultation with him, when Julia Gillard reshuffled, she shuffled all the ministers and actually now has less ministers looking over the department.
So is there a feeling that you feel like you've been downgraded?
Well, it's not
in
so
the
much,
eyes of government?
It's not so much that, but, this is a department that requires greater accountability. And since the 1974 bureaucratic changes in the Department of Defence, the department's just grown too big. There needs to be far more accountability. There needs to be a statutory board managing the department. All of these things the Defence Association has talked about for years. We have always led calls to reform the Department of Defence. And, that's our job as a public interest watchdog. Now, it's just annoying that people are now accusing us of the opposite, of somehow covering up for the department when we're the one that's exposed previous scandals.
But can I just ask again, how do you see a way through this? How do you see a way of a coming together, of improving the communications and stopping the sense of division between the two parties?
Well, one of the ways would be for the Minister to unmuzzle the Defence Force so it could defend itself in public. I mean, all public affairs in the Defence Force is controlled through the Minister's office and through the defence bureaucracy. We should go back to what we had in the early 1990s when ADF commanders at every level were allowed to run their own public affairs. So if something happened, they could talk to reporters. They could explain to the Australian people what's going on. That would be the single greatest reform they could bring in overnight after fixing the degree and numbers of ministerial oversight.
Just a final one for me, going back to those allegations. Are you happy with the way that they're investigated? Any changes need to be made there?
Look, I think the Minister... there's one fault with all inquiries, and that's they're not actually examining none of them, funnily enough. Well, they're not funny, because he set the terms of reference. None of them are investigating his behaviour last week. The advantage of having a Royal Commission would be it would actually look at some other problems, and it may indeed come to that. But public confidence needs to be restored, and it needs to be restored basically because of the hysterical witch hunt that occurred last week. I mean, the Defence Academy is in Campbell in the Australian Capital Territory. It's not in Salem, Massachusetts in the 17th century. And that's essentially what happened last week.
Neil James, thank you for coming in.
Thank you.